theists. We've got Ben Watkins versus perspective philosophy. I'm going to go ahead and just get this thing rolling. Perspective philosophy, the floor is all yours.
Hello there. Really nice to be back on here. Very nice to see Ben. Happy to. I think we've spoke only on Twitter, so it's nice to actually finally, put a face to the conversation. But yeah, like it's tonight is obviously theism versus atheism from two Hegelians, and I'm incredibly unprepared for this. I've been writing on something entirely different, so I haven't formulated an argument. So the way that I think would be best to proceed is outline just how I think about it and from my perspective. And then obviously if Ben has any criticisms or questions, obviously I'm sure he'll hone in on specific metaphysical and epistemological points that he would like to drive home, and I'll do my best to refute them. Okay. So since I'm giving the affirmative, I'm going first. So I would begin really from my perspective with a cosmological argument. I would say specifically an argument from sufficient reason. I would take primarily a Leibnizian or Leibnizian-esque view, in that I think for every fact there must be a sufficient reason. So if all contingent objects do not contain the reason for their own existence, so for example, like that's what defines a contingent object. So why does this table exist? Because someone, cut down a tree, formed the wood, put it together, finished it, and then put it in the store and I bought it, right? So that causal chain which pre-existed the existence of this object is the explanation, is the sufficient reason for the existence of this object. And more logically speaking, it identifies that all identities specifically, or identifies that all identities, it indicates that all identities have, if they are contingent and not necessary, must have an other identity which essentially led to their existence. So this establishes a chain of reason, which allows for the capacity for an explanation. So then I can say, this is what an object is, and it can be understood as such. And Aristotle was the first to identify this, which is why he came up with the four causes, which include an efficient cause and a final cause, the beginning of an instance of a being and the end instance of a being. And what we call the being is essentially the unity of the start of its identity and the end of its identity. And this has been something that's been debated for a long time, whether this actually exists or not. We'll see if we get so far. But so long as we accept that this identity is real, there had to be some sort of cause which led it to come into reality. Now, if this chain is established and that all contingent beings must have a reason for their existence, then it can either form an infinite regress or it must end in a perfectly actual being, or a perfectly necessary being in Leibnizian terms. This means that it contains the reason for its own existence. So the reason for its own existence can only be understood in relation to itself, that it can't actually be explained by something prior to it. So, a being's existence is in relation to someone having done something else or someone having created it. This would be what we could usually call potential or possibility. But in this case, we'll call it contingency. This is something which essentially marks a limitation of a being, something which indicates that there is something causing it external to itself. Okay. It can either be an infinite regress or something which is necessary, which has no causes external to itself. It is causa sui, absolutely self-cause. My point is to basically argue that this chain of reason cannot be an infinite regress, that an infinite regress leads to having no causal chain, because the infinite implies that there is actually no first established rational structure which allows for the contingent being to be explained. We're often to explain it through essentially a never-ending series of infinite beings which owe their existence to another infinite being, which owes its existence to another infinite being. And the first movement of this chain never occurred. There is no first movement. As such, there is no reason to believe that there will be a last movement, or to believe that this causal chain could just simply cease from existing. Therefore, there has to be a necessary being. There has to be a being which is necessarily absolutely self-caused. So that is essentially a very broken down view of the Leibnizian argument for sufficient reason. It's been given many different names. It originated from the Aristotelian cosmological argument. A lot of people use the Calem cosmological argument. It's one in favor, arguably mostly today. I think Leibniz gave the best one, because from a Hegelian standpoint, everything, and even from an Aquinian standpoint, everything boils down to identity. Everything boils down to a logical unity, not necessarily just a sort of material existence or whatever it may be. It doesn't have the same metaphysical baggage. So I think the Leibnizian one's the best. So from that point, I would move on to a teleological argument. So I would basically say that this unity, this movement or change that we like to perceive in relation to sufficient reasons, implies a unity between a being's first cause and its last cause. This unity we would call an identity. For every identity, what we are positing is essentially an essence, something which absolutely explains the being's existence. Every being and its movement then must be trying to essentially establish its essence. So the existence of a being is the attempt to establish its essence. So in other words, every first instance of its being is being drawn towards the last instance of its being. Now, that might sound like strange. Why would it be drawn and not necessarily accidentally moving or whatever? But the point is to establish that the unity of the first and last in terms of the identity of the being and what establishes the meaning of an identity of a being is essentially the unity, the rational principle which unites the first instance of the being and the last instance of the being. That would be its essence. So all beings are understood relative to their essence. All beings must aim towards the completion of their essence in order for change to actually be a conceivable and understandable process. So all beings are essentially trying to actualize themselves. So we're in a process of actualization. This is where we would normally argue from potency to actuality. You could see it from, in terms of, from sufficiency to necessity, if you like. That which is perfectly actual is perfectly complete. So if there is an absolutely necessary being with no causes outside of itself, which I'm hoping that the first argument is establishing, that being is absolutely united. It is perfectly complete and it's perfectly good. And moreover, it establishes what is an identity relation that is absolutely one with itself. It is something which unites being and essence, which means that it is possible and necessarily possible that a being can obtain its essence. If a being cannot obtain its essence and it is impossible or does not obtain its essence necessarily, then there can be no description of their being existence, which means that you wouldn't actually be able to say there was a unified existence. So existence and its essence must necessarily be united to have established a concrete identity. And then this relates to what is very famously understood as the ontological argument. The ontological argument is to say that that it is better for a perfect being to exist than to not exist. Now, the reason I would say that essentially it is better for a perfect being to exist than not to exist and therefore must exist actually makes sense is because, one, I would reject the Kantian view that existence isn't a predicate to some degree. But moreover, what we're actually talking about is that a being's good in the first instance, as the teleological argument is to establish, is its completeness. A being which is necessarily complete is perfectly good, and so it is perfectly united. So if we are to talk about any form of actual existence, we're going to talk about a being which is perfectly one with its essence. And, I'm sure, Ben, you'll know from the Thomistic point of view, that is essentially God, a being which is absolutely one with its essence. So when we say that a perfect being absolutely must exist because it's better to exist, that is true. Now, I do acknowledge some limitations to this argument. I don't think the Kantian refutation was a good one. I do think that Aquinas' refutation is the better refutation, which is essentially to say, I can't imagine that being. I can't perceive the absolute unity of existence with itself. Hegel would call this absolute knowing, and so that would be at the end of history. But as you'll know, that is the necessary goal from which everything is aiming towards for Hegel. It is the absolute unity of essence, of existence with its essence. And so change as we are perceiving it from, the cosmological standpoint, from the teleological standpoint, is moving towards this absolute ontological unity. So the cosmological and the teleological argument essentially are established by the ontological argument. So if you were to refute the ontological argument, you would essentially refute the cosmological and teleological argument. But the point of the ontological argument in many ways is really just to establish that there has to be a unity between being and essence, a perfect unity between existence and essence. And without that unity, essentially, truth wouldn't function. They wouldn't actually be able to have a coherent conception of reality. There would be no end and beginning, which would allow for a point of analysis, which we could say things are changing, that change can be understood, that we can identify individual specific beings in relation to that causal chain or that chain of sufficient reasons. And so we wouldn't have the existence of individual facts. So with that, that's why I personally believe. I think a lot of people would probably find that a bit of a mouthful. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to maybe formulate it a bit better. But I'm happy for Ben to press us on any of that. And if there's anything I can do to clear things up, I'm happy to do it. And thank you. I'll forfeit the rest of my time.
Well, for someone who claimed to be unprepared, you certainly volleyed up a great intro. Well done.
That was great.
Before I pass things on to Ben, I just want to let everyone here know you're watching Modern Day Debate, a neutral platform for topics like religion, science, politics. Our vision, our goal here is to create a safe space for people to come put their arguments to the test against other people. And so far, we have done pretty well with 130,000 subscribers, but we don't want to stop there. We want to keep going. So if you want to be able to say someday, I remember Modern Day Debate when it only had 130,000 subscribers, now is the time to hit that subscribe button. And while you're on your way over to that subscribe button, stop by that little thumbs up and click on that. Also, one last quick thing, 13 days from now, if you think the temperature is hot in Austin now, just wait. In 13 days, Modern Day Debate is going live on stage. So you guys can pick up some tickets in the description below. And if you are not in the Austin area or not planning to move there in the next 13 days, you can still support us at an Indigo campaign, also in the description below. Ben, with that, if you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Right. Do I need to share?
Yes, you do.
My screen with you. Can you see it?
Nope.
Nope.
You got to click on the screen share there.
Got it.
Perfect.
All right. Let me begin by first thanking Lewis for agreeing to have this discussion with me. I've been really looking forward to this, to be able to kind of take a deep dive into metaphysics. And I also want to thank Modern Day Debate for inviting us on. My aim is to defend the following claim. I'm going to defend the claim that rather than believing God has created mankind in his own image, we should instead believe all gods were created in our image. Both Lewis and myself agree our experiences make the world more intelligible to us, but where we differ is in our explanatory frameworks, that is, in how we explain why the world is the way it is. I take Lewis to be what's called a perfect being theist, or theist for short, where theism is the view there is a supernatural, non-physical mind over and above the natural causal order. God has certain properties to an infinite degree: power, wisdom, and benevolence, creator and designer of the natural world, Lord and Savior, and a being wholly worthy of our reverence and worship. If we want to understand ourselves and our place in the universe, we will need to appeal to God's intentional creative activity. In other words, we are an explandinum and God is the explanans. By contrast, I'm a metaphysical naturalist, or naturalist for short. Metaphysical naturalism is the view that the causal order is nothing over and above the natural causal order. That is, there are no supernatural, non-physical minds like God, demons, or any souls. Metaphysical naturalism entails there is a natural history of religion where God is explained as a human phenomena. If we want to understand the gods, we should understand how they are created in our image rather than as us being created in theirs. Metaphysical naturalism reverses the order of explanation from that of theism. Rather than God as an explanandum, we are the explanans. Though I will make use of both inductive and deductive inferences, it's important to realize my case is broadly abductive. Abductive reasoning appeals to explicitly to explanatory considerations, which is why they are sometimes called inferences to the best explanation. It involves selecting the most probable explanation among various competing explanations. Because this method is broadly probabilistic, it doesn't guarantee certainty like a mathematical demonstration would, but it does aim to find the most reasonable view to believe given the available evidence. We can visualize abductive reasoning using a helpful schema from the philosophy C.S. Peirce. The first stage of the schema is to observe some surprising fact, then to understand how that surprising fact would be a matter of course given some hypothesis, and then hence we would have some reason to suspect that hypothesis to be true. If the initial probability of the evidence is low, and a hypothesis entails it, then the probability of that hypothesis given the evidence is greater than the initial probability of the hypothesis. If we interpret there is reason to suspect that H is true as the probability that the evidence is true given the hypothesis is greater than the initial probability, then we can prove Peirce's schema using Bayes' theorem. Because I'm making use of both Peirce's schema and Bayes' theorem, I need to say something about the prior probability of theism and naturalism. That is, the probability either view is true given only our background knowledge. Prior probability is important in this context because one of my aims will be to show that naturalism is a better explanation than theism because naturalism has better trade-offs between explanatory power and prior probability compared with theism. Prior probability of a hypothesis is determined by its scope, simplicity, and its consistency with our background knowledge. Given that naturalism and theism constitute comprehensive worldviews, I will assume their explanatory scopes to be roughly equal. According to Occam's razor, all else being equal, we ought to favor simpler hypotheses over more complex ones, and simplicity is a function of elegance and parsimony. Naturalism proves simpler than theism on both accounts. In terms of parsimony, naturalism requires fewer ontological commitments. All plausible worldviews share an ontological commitment to a natural causal order, making it a fundamental subset of any plausible worldview. However, the ontological commitments of theism are over and above any natural causal order, requiring entities like God, heaven, and souls. Furthermore, hypotheses can be deemed less elegant if they evade refutation solely by invoking ad hoc assumptions. Hence, hypotheses are less simple the more unfalsifiable they are. Theism often relies on such ad hoc assumptions regarding God's psychology, such as his goals, preferences, and beliefs, or theodicies attempting to explain the presence of evil. In contrast, naturalism does not require any such assumptions, rendering theism less elegant compared to naturalism. So naturalism is simpler than theism. The last component of prior probability is consistency with background knowledge. Consider, for instance, the entirety of mental activity encompassing known consciousness, the fulfillment of intentions, choices, beliefs, memories, and cognitive processes. These activities are intricately intertwined with physical events, manifested as diverse patterns of neural activity within complex, structured, embodied brains that have biologically evolved. Conversely, proponents of theism posit that God's mind exists over and above anything with a physical location in spacetime. If all mental activity in our experience depends on something physical, then the existence of entirely non-physical and unembodied minds becomes improbable relative to that exceptionalist experience of physically embodied minds. Given the empirical findings of neuroscience and psychology, which reveal strong correlations between mental activity and physical processes, it becomes probable that all mental phenomena depend upon something physical. Consequently, the claims made by theism are likely to be false for this reason. Given naturalism is simpler than theism, and naturalism entails that all minds are physically dependent, naturalism becomes more probable than theism. How can theism overcome its low prior probability? Theists ideally seek to compensate for this by emphasizing its explanatory power. However, that will require us to decide what the empirical content of theism is. If God is analogous to a human person, then we might be able to independently specify what God would do in some situation, given what a human person would do in an analogous situation. However, as we will see, specifying theism's empirical content in this way will leave it vulnerable to disconfirmation by the problems of evil and hiddenness. Alternatively, we might instead claim God is not like an agent in the sense of having beliefs, intentions, thoughts, or desires, but then it's not clear how the empirical content of theism is any different from that of naturalism. Denying the personal features of God will leave us wondering if the object we are considering could even respond to our religious concerns, like answering prayers, performing miracles, offering salvation, making promises, or even caring about us at all. Additionally, it becomes unclear whether God could serve any explanatory role at all. Let's first consider theistic personalism and suppose God is more like an agent. If there really is any supreme person worthy of the title God, then we already saw its power, wisdom, and love are infinite. By infinite love, I mean a quality of character disposed to eliminate suffering so as far as can be properly done. However, predation, starvation, and disease, integral in the biological evolution of human and non-human animals, involves a great deal of suffering that someone with infinite power and wisdom could properly prevent. Therefore, there is no being such as God. Notice this is a logical problem. Either God permits the impermissible, what we believe is evil is not really impermissible, or God does not exist. In the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, God's only excuse is that he does not exist. Now, let us suppose either God's power, wisdom, or goodness are finite rather than infinite. This resolves the previous logical problem at a great theological cost, but it does not solve an evidential argument from the people. We can see this with a famous argument from David Hume, and this will be an inference to the best explanation. He says 4 hypotheses can be formed concerning the first causes of the universe: that they are endowed with perfect goodness, that they have perfect malice, that they are opposite and have both goodness and malice, that they have neither goodness nor malice. Mixed phenomena can never prove the 2 former unmixed principles, and the uniformity and steadiness of general laws seem to oppose the third. The fourth, therefore, seems by far the most probable. That is, the first causes of the universe are neutral with regard to good and bad. There are parallel logical and evidential arguments from hiddenness too. Some people lose their belief in God through time, while others may have never entertained such a belief at all. Importantly, this absence of belief or lack thereof is neither emotional nor behavioral opposition towards God. And God's perfect love implies maximal openness to relationship. By analogy, a perfectly loving parent ensures nothing they do hinders a relationship with their child. Turning to Nietzsche again, a God who is all-loving and all-powerful and who does not even make sure his creatures understand his intentions, could that be a God of goodness? If a good and loving God is indeed open to relationship, every finite person believes there is a God unless they were resisting such a belief. After all, a belief that God exists is a necessary condition for any sort of meaningful relationship. Therefore, God's love entails that there are no non-theists who are not resisting God. However, there are non-resistant non-theists. Therefore, there is no being such as God. Again, one might be tempted to avoid this logical problem by claiming God possesses limited power, wisdom, or love. But this move would also fail to address the evidential problem of divine hiddenness. Non-resistant non-theists are surprising given theism, but a matter of course given naturalism. This is the purse schema. So hiddenness, in addition to evil, presents theism with serious evidential challenges. Let's call this the evidential problem. Let's call this evidential problem for theism the problem of disconfirmation. We might be tempted to sidestep these worries by following classical theists rather than theistic personalists. Instead, suppose God is less like an agent rather than more. But now the empirical content of theism becomes indistinguishable from naturalism. We lose any grounds we might have had for claiming theism had any explanatory power that is distinct from naturalism. Natural theology is the research project that attempts to justify theism using human reason alone. And my final evidential consideration against theism is that natural theology is noticeably absent from contemporary science. In fact, science has no need for God in the way it needs electrons or black holes. A widely accepted feature of contemporary historical and natural science takes the form of an epistemic rule. Methodological naturalism is the view that our most compelling explanatory endeavors should proceed as if metaphysical naturalism were true, because theism is a poor explanation in practice. Naturalism is sufficient, if only provisional working ontology for our explanatory theorizing. When asked by Napoleon what place God had in his model for the solar system, Laplace is alleged to have bluntly quipped back, "Je ne vis pas besoin de citer hypothesis," which translates to, "I had no need for that hypothesis." Whether this event is historically accurate or not is not the point. What it illustrates is a methodological naturalism that has garnered the support of 4 centuries of historical and scientific progress natural theology has not similarly enjoyed. Naturalistic hypotheses frequently supplant theistic explanations, but the reverse is never observed. Natural entities find their way into our best explanations with little fuss, but supernatural entities always seem to elude our experiences of the world. When comparing theism and naturalism as 2 competing research projects since the Enlightenment, methodological naturalism has emerged as the preferred explanatory framework, while natural theology has been eschewed. When we consider the evidence and the patterns of scientific progress, the success of methodological naturalism is surprising given theism, but a matter of course given naturalism. Again, this is the purse schema. Let's call this methodological problem for theism the problem of theological skepticism. In our examination of the explanatory virtues of theism and naturalism, we found theism wanting. Theism has a low prior probability, little to no explanatory power insofar as God is less like an agent, and is disconfirmed by evil and hiddenness insofar as God is more like an agent. Moreover, the contemporary historical and natural sciences have made stunning progress within a methodological naturalist framework, whereas natural theology is a failed research project. Naturalism, on the other hand, provides a simple, well-supported, even if only provisional, explanatory framework more consistent with what we already know than theism. When we engage our best explanatory theorizing based on publicly available evidence, theistic hypotheses enjoy no theoretical advantages over naturalism, or so I argue. I take these 4 theoretical virtues to be uncontroversially theoretically virtuous, and they justify a theoretical preference for metaphysical naturalism rather than theism. To overcome this, Lewis needs to distinguish his Hegelian form of theism from my metaphysical naturalism, and then explain either how any of these virtues supports theism over naturalism, or will have to provide additional virtues he believes favors theism over naturalism on the whole. And unless until he can do that, I think we have more reason to prefer naturalism to theism. And I'll end there.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Well done. Anyone here, in case you're wondering where James is, well, I'll tell you, he's on Mars looking under rocks for peoples with fingers in their ears to let them know that Modern Day Debate is going live on stage in Texas, November 4th and 5th. So make sure that you call all your friends in Austin and let them know they need to go and check out this event. Okay, for those of you who aren't going to be able to make it, no worries. You can show your love and support in the Indigo campaign in the description below. We're about to go into the open discussion section where I'm going to let these gentlemen freestyle some arguments back and forth. But don't be shy. This is not just a two-way street. If you have some comments or questions you want to share via Super Chat, now's the time. It'll be a first come, first serve. So if we don't get to your super chat, I'll apologize in advance. Also, please try to keep them respectful if you want them read as written. Okay? I will just quiet myself now and let you gentlemen go free. Have fun.
Yeah, that was really great, Ben. Actually,
Since I did the last, why don't you kick things off with questions? That seems to make the most sense.
If you're okay with that, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I actually really enjoyed what you said. I disagree with it, obviously, you know, but I can see
Dang,
why
I was so close.
I know, you know, obviously, I see why you're saying what you're saying, but. So just to start from, so we'll start. I think there's so much that you covered there that it's actually painfully difficult to work out what is the best part to hone in on. What I did notice overall is that there is a discontinuity between what is like with you. You describe yourself as a Hegelian, right?
Yes.
And what I would take as a traditionally Hegelian stance, which is idealism, and the naturalistic approach, which you're proposing, which seems to put existence prior to essence, right? Which is why, like, you know, when you talk about, you know, man is not made in the image of God, but God is made in the image of man. That's like a Feuerbach quote, right? Which is the birth of like post-Hegelian materialism. But to start from the sort of, like, you know, maybe from the points in which you say that it's the sort of refutation, or the power of naturalism, the explanatory power of naturalism over Hegelianism, why it's superior as a position. So the final one was that naturalism is part of a successful tradition while theism has failed. I mean, that's yet to be established. And I would say, like, in terms of the scientific tradition, in terms of scientific analysis, for example, my position, which I've just outlined, is 100% compatible with natural science and natural scientific explanations of the way in which physical objects work. So I don't see anything in terms of naturalism which aids us in the ways in which we would, you know, as Napoleon says, he didn't need it. I would, you know, I would argue in terms of the principle of sufficient reason that he just hasn't realized that he's been utilizing essentially a deductive principle which implies the existence of God without having taken note of it. So whether naturalism is part of a successful tradition while theism has failed, I think that's yet to be established. Naturalism has more explanatory power. Again, I think that has to be established in the way that you'd have to say, okay, naturalism allows us to explain something that theism does not allow us to explain. But I don't see that. In fact, I see quite the inverse, where behind the abductive reasoning which you are relying upon for your Bayesian probabilism is essentially a deductive relation between of identity, which Hegel points out, and which Hegel believes to be the foundation of the Christian God, which is essentially, you know, existence with itself, absolute truth, which he takes to be mind, which I think relates back to the point in which you said that a mind exists only inside of, let's say, a neurological structure. It seems that that's completely against Hegel. So that's another point which I'm a little bit unsure on. But I don't see how, but more of a question, I don't see in what way is naturalism offering more explanatory power. Naturalism being more consistent. I don't think that, I think that would rely upon, I see what your point is to say that essentially it's relying upon the inconsistencies that would be implicit from a failure to outline or explain theodicies, and like in relation to the problem of evil primarily, or divine hiddenness. I personally don't think that God is hidden. I don't think that there is any actual divine hiddenness per se. And the problem of evil, I think, is a misunderstanding of what actually is good and evil in the first place. So if I'm wrong on what good and evil are, or whether God is hidden, then you're right on that, and vice versa, you know. And then obviously naturalism is simpler. I think that the thing is that it depends on how you're going to offer an explanation, a formal explanation of the unity of existence with itself that isn't essentially what Hegel would call a mind, and in relation of absolute knowing, which is retrocausative, right? This is the establishment which begins the essential logical movement of reality, which explains causation, which explains identity, not in such a way as to be limited to specific individual instances, but is to explain the formal relation of identities and sufficient reason itself. So I don't really see how a naturalistic explanation is simpler, in the sense that it usually ends up positing explanations which are incredibly contentious, whether it's like there is an infinite number of universes, there is essentially an infinite number of possible ways in which the universe has been actualized, and they are absolutely being actualized in the same way, and a plethora of other untestable, unverified hypotheses, which theoretical physics is filled with. So, I mean, maybe if you could point towards a naturalistic theory which offers a greater explanation, a simpler explanation than a theistic one. But I can certainly posit naturalistic theories which offer more convoluted and complex ones. So that's where I think maybe we'll kick it off.
Awesome. So yeah, I think now would be a really good point for me to kind of broadly unpack what it is when I say that I'm a Hegelian, because in one sense, I'm kind of saying it tongue in cheek, because I'm an analytic philosopher, and Hegel is just kind of considered the boogeyman devil in analytic circles. And I really want to push back on that, because I actually think that Hegel has a lot of valuable insights that the analytic tradition ignores to its detriment. So there's one sense in which I'm being kind of coy by calling myself a Hegelian, but there's another sense in which I'm quite serious in the fact that I find themes in Hegel that I think are very, very illuminating. At least they have been to how I think about deep questions. And so really kind of the four themes that I find in both Hegel's phenomenology of spirit and his science of logic is, first being this idea that thought and meaning depend on a community. So this is Wilfrid Sellars expressed this as the myth of the given, this idea that we just kind of have this unmediated pure knowledge that doesn't depend in any way on the social conventions or language conventions of our community. I think that's a very deep insight of Hegel. Another theme that I find is that knowledge of objects as they are in themselves is always mediated by concepts. So you mentioned earlier how there is this strain of idealism that's found in Hegel that I do sympathize with, but it's what's called objective idealism. And so, to use the jargon, the idea is that the real is the rational and the rational is the real. And so what this means is that the reason that the world is intelligible to us is because we are ourselves products of the world. And so if the world has a rational structure, we have a rational structure, and that rational structure is what allows us to find the world intelligible. And so this is another theme, probably the most important theme for the way I think, is this idea that thought and beings are abstractions of the same rational whole. So the idea that there's just one reality, but we have these two ways of conceptualizing it. So again, to refer to Wilfrid Sellars, he sees the identity of the world being this identity between what he calls the logical space of reasons and the realm of law. And so the logical space of reasons is where we characterize things like agency, reasons, mathematics, logic, ethics. And the realm of law is the causal domain. So it's what's studied by the natural science and where we find all of our experience. And then obviously Hegel, the major theme that really makes Hegel famous, I think, is the idea that the events of history are the progress of humans towards greater freedom. So Lewis mentioned how there's this idea like history can have an end to it. This idea that there's some, trying not to use the Hegelian jargon, but I don't know how to not use it. He calls it absolute knowing. So it's this idea that there's this final point where spirit, what Hegel calls spirit, becomes aware of itself as a thinking thing that knows things in the world. So with those four themes is really kind of how I approach big questions like the question of God's existence. So for example, to use the thought and being are abstractions of the same rational whole, I think that we have a knowledge of things and we have a knowledge of truths. And that in some sense, all the things and all the truths that there are in the world are identical to one whole. And so this kind of takes us deeper into Hegel and more into Neoplatonism, the idea of Plotinus and the idea of the one. So there he calls the zeroth form matter. He calls the first form the one. He calls the second the divine mind, and then the fourth the good. And so my Hegelian picture just cuts out the divine mind, just says that, look, no, all you need is matter and the one, and then the concept of the goodness and the concept of a divine mind is just unnecessary. And so the type of mind that I deny as fundamental of the universe is the being that has thoughts and intentions and beliefs and makes choices and acts for reasons. So I think that those are all complex results of physical arrangements of matter, like a biologically evolved brain. And so I think taking that picture of a person and putting it at the foundational level, at the level of matter and the one, I think that's the mistake. I think that's the theistic mistake. That's where I would want to say, no, that's putting God as the explandum and us as the explanans. And instead, we should reverse this, remove the divine mind from the picture entirely. God then the divine mind becomes the explanandum, and we are the explanans. So that's broadly. I know I use a lot of Hegelian jargon. I tried not to, but I just don't know how to express these ideas without using those terms.
No. I mean, I I understand you, right? But like whether anyone, I know the feeling like transpose this into normal human.
I know there's a lot of
Yeah.
people who have not read Hegel listening to this going, what in the world is he talking about?
Specifically, I think as well, the Hegel that you're referencing, especially with Sellers, sounds very Brandon.
Yeah.
You're like
Very much so. Yes.
Brandon.
Robert Brandom,
Yeah.
Wilfred Sellers, C.S. Peirce,
I'm
very influential. John McDowell. They've been very influential for me.
I'm very much classically Hegelian in the sense that I'm right Hegelian. So I'm not even
left Hegelian. That's why this debate's so awesome.
I heard Feuerbach. It's straight away. Yeah, 100%.
I threw some Nietzsche in there just for good measure. Just because.
But I will say, like, so there's some issues there though. So this first is in relation of like when you say that you've sort of this foundation of matter. What do you mean by matter? And then what do you mean by mind? Because obviously you did reference objective idealism, or like Hegel like calls it, even he goes further than objective idealism. He calls it absolute. I often call it objective idealism, so it's no shade, but it's absolute idealism, isn't it? So it's the unity of the subject and the object to the point of like the absolute, which is why it is the point of absolute self-awareness. So we're all being drawn towards this point of absolute self-awareness. Now, he points out that we are being drawn towards this point of self-awareness because there is this relation of a real essence in existence, rather than a sort of theoretical essence. But when we talk about matter, Hegel talks about, so when we talk about mind, it's like a unity of ideas, but we can get onto that in a minute. When we talk about matter, it's very specifically for Hegel. He references like the objective world as a petrified intelligence. He doesn't ever say there is a real concrete matter. In fact, like, because matter is always given in terms of an essence from which it exhibits, right? So you would say, like, if I was to ask you what is matter, you'll give me an instance of matter in which you might say, oh, this is wood, this is copper. You might reference an element, or you might reference another sort of form of matter. and no matter how far you sort of break this down, you could break it down into atoms. You'll reference sort of molecular structures. You might reference subatomic particles, and you might reference energy. At the very bottom, you might reference energy. Regardless, you're going to have to give essentially what Hegel sees as essentially a qualitative-quantitative distinction, a relationship. So you're going to say that there exists a thing with specific, a specific real principality, and that there is, and it concretely exists. That actually exists. There is how many of them? What is it? So what is it, and how many of them exist, or whatever. You could think of this as like in energy. In terms of energy, it'd be like sort of wavelength and amplitude. Like the quality, the sort of specific conditions of the wave with the mathematical sort of strength of the sort of strength of the wave versus the frequency of the wave. Whatever sort of way you're going to break this down, whether it becomes as abstract as energy, it's always going to break down into this point of if it actually relating to a form. There is never a sort of prime matter as sort of Aristotle sort of refers to, right, in Hegel. It's always a petrified form, a stagnant specific essence. It's never given a material concrete existence outside of that. And that has to be the case for Hegel, because he sees that the empiricist tradition has absolutely failed. And moreover, he's placing essence as essentially the primary moving cause of a specific being's existence. It's the unity of a being's existence, right? It's the identity. So to say that it is, let's say, copper, wood, or whatever, is to presume it has an essence, to presume that it has that unity. So do you think that there is these real essences? Or is this like matter some sort of abstract thing? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So, short answer, it's complicated. So for me, I'm going to want to distinguish between abstract objects and concrete objects, but I'm going to want to say that this identity is not sharp that this distinction is not sharp because there is an identity, sort of like how there's an identity between water and H2O. We can draw a sharp distinction between the two. Water is the stuff that, boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit and falls from the clouds as rain. But we can also say that there's, water in the sense of having one oxygen molecule and two hydrogen molecules that behave in certain ways at certain temperatures and pressures and yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, they come out to be an identity. So for me, this one of the ways in which I part from Hegel, I guess gravitate towards Martin Heidegger, the idea that nothing noughts. That was one of his famous.
Good old Heidegger, yeah.
Yeah, one of his famous quotes. And these ideas have been developed more recently by the philosopher Erich Steinhardt in his book Atheistic Platonism. And so the idea is that nothing negates itself. And so the reason why there is something rather than nothing is because there is a negation of nothingness. And so a negative times a negative is a positive. And so you get this positive becoming. So Hegel in The Science of Logic famously says that, if our thesis is nothing or is being, then our antithesis, he doesn't use these terms, is non-being. Yeah. And so that the synthesis of being and non-being is where we get the idea of temporal becoming. This idea of, in more contemporary literature, is called the sway of the negative. But the idea is that this proof more or less gets what's being itself. This is the, again, the only way I know how to talk about this is in abstract metaphors, where so nothingness is like the sea and being is an island coming out of the sea. And so you can't equate being itself with any particular being. That's that's a very Hegelian notion, and is that if you want to understand
The
being
hard
itself, you're going to have to.
kernel of the real. I think it's often the surface tension of the water, the hard kernel of the real,
Yeah,
that which captures.
that's
Yeah,
such a
yeah.
great way of visualizing it. Yes. And so at the end of all this metaphysical speculation, in my view, is okay, do we have something that is God? Or do we have something that is close to a naturalistic hypothesis that involves something like a hypothesis of indifference, something that is just indifferent to our religious concerns? So I take us, when we approach this question, we have certain religious concerns. We want to know, what is our relationship to this? We want to know what our deepest good is. We want to know if our prayers will be answered. We want to know if evil will be defeated in the end, or we'll find salvation. And so, do I have something at the end of these metaphysical speculation that resembles this being worthy of worship and reverence? And so that's where I came across the two problems. One I called the problem of disconfirmation, and the other one was the problem of theological skepticism. So if we assume that being itself is more like a person, is like us in some analogous sense, then we find that being disconfirmed by the problems of evil and hiddenness. So when you said, the explanatory power of naturalism, well, the hypothesis of indifference built into naturalism explains non-resistant non-theists, and it explains all the facts we observe about evil.
Right.
With theological skepticism, we say, okay, look, God's less like us. It's not like, we shouldn't idolatrize God. He's not, a person personified. He's being himself. Okay, well, now it's hard to distinguish this hypothesis from the naturalist hypothesis that I put on there. These other ways of thinking about these metaphysical speculations. So the question becomes, okay, we can quibble about simplicity, consistency with background knowledge, but what role explanatorily does God serve at that point? This will bring us back to methodological naturalism. Science needs theoretical postulates like electrons, black holes. Like, we can't make sense of our experience of the world without those theoretical postulates. But it seems that we can make sense of the world without postulating a being worthy of our worship, a being that is infinite in goodness, power, wisdom, makes choices, acts for reasons, and cares about us.
This is where you kind of hit the point of thinness, right? Where it's like you can postulate these things without actually having taken note of them. So if you postulate, so the whole point of what Aquinas is saying is like, based on the fact that we necessarily have to postulate some good that we are moving towards, gives us an argument from graduation, which is essentially the teleological argument, and likewise, essentially postulating a universal chain of causation and sufficient reason is what gives us the ability to to allow for explanation and concrete establishment of identities and understanding that there is specific beings in the world. So when you talk about, for example, like this idea that water was this the nothing nots, and from that point you get this negation of itself, which is that's very Hegelian as well, as much as it's Heideggerian. I think the difference is with Hegel is that he doesn't use it's not that you begin with nothing which negates itself. It's that being and nothing are identical because they're so far abstract from each other that they would be the same anyway, infinitely unknowable.
I'll be honest with you too. My Heidegger knowledge isn't quite where it should be yet.
Oh no, that's fine.
Working on it.
Heidegger's one of those. Right? But the sort of I mean, Heidegger, like we don't need to talk about Heidegger anyway. Like the point is that really is that when we talk about this hard kernel of the real, like Hegel comes to the point of saying at the end of this that there is a real, concrete, established being. What he calls existence. That the ground, I think he describes it as the ground, which is the unity of identity and difference, which is essentially that which allows us to postulate a limited, real, concrete object, is essentially when it's inverted, then we'll have existence, and when we'll have the unity of this sort of logical relation, then we have what we would call existence. And point that he's kind of making here is to say that there has to be. It's not that there is this permanent state of becoming. Hegel says no, it completes. It is completed. That time there is an end to this, which allows us to say that it's a principled unity in which we can say that existence is a single thing, which gives us credence to be able to say that there is individual things in relation to the lives that we live. For example, when you talk about water, you're right in saying essentially that depending upon the language game, used to steal a term from Wittgenstein, depending upon the language game that you're engaging in, you've got the language game of water, which might be, something you splash around in, you drink, whatever. And you have the language game of essentially chemistry. And each one, like depending on how you're using that, it has a specific role in a human life. Now, what Hegel's really saying in this is that all essences are in relation to an overall end, which is essentially positing that there is a correct and a true way of establishing not just one way of understanding the world, but this is where you get the right. There is the right way of us understanding the world. There is the true and the complete. Now, this might mean that in various instances we postulate different substantial considerations of the self, but the self ultimately has to be united in this relation of all facts with each other, to the point in which I can say, well, there's the way in which I should talk about water in this instance, and then there is the way in which I should talk about water in that instance, if I'm able to achieve my overall good, which gives meaning to why I'm even establishing, like to steal a Heideggerian concept again, the idea of language as a form of equipment. There is an underlying precondition of ourselves towards an end point, and that point is a truth, a unity. And the thing is, when you talk about matter, you see, matter for Hegel is it's an emptiness. It doesn't have anything other than that it can actually obtain reality in the sense that it relates to some sort of form. So if I say like there is this material existence, I'm just positing an actual concrete idea, which is why you would relate that to his objective idealism. But remember, the objective and the subjective are co-defined to the point in which when I'm positing the relationship of a man to water in these various instances, both can be correct in relation to an objective reality, which has what Heidegger would call a fittingness of the concept, which is essentially my capacity to relate to it in a way which gives meaning. So, like, I might use language as a form of equipment, but there actually is a correct and an incorrect way of understanding reality, which means there is an actual real essence. And to say, like, when we reference something like matter, what we're doing is we're externalizing that. We're saying that we're destroying that subjectivity, which is sort of the foundation of what you're saying here. And if we say it's just material, then the essence is unimportant. It gets taken away, and matter becomes unintelligible. If we say it's just essence, then it has no concrete existence. It's just in our minds. It's subjective. So it's either we have to unite, and the whole point of Hegel is to say that there is this unity of subjective and objective, which when taken to the nth degree gives us truth. Now he wants to say that that truth is a self-conscious being in his mind. But before we can even get to that point, I have to be able to agree with you that what we're observing externally isn't some sort of material which is alien from an idea and something radically different, but is essentially a real, logical, formal existent. It's a logos, it's a logic, it's a real quality or quantity. And in which case, I mean, that's all Hegel really means when he's talking about ideas, right? And that's the sort of the allegorical nature between what we consider like ideas in our mind, the positing of words and language, which is an essence, and the actual thing which we're referencing.
So, I want to make sure that I haven't misrepresented you, because I said in my opening, or at least I defined theism as this idea that there is a non-physical mind. So it's a mind without a location in space-time that transcends the natural causal order. But the way you talk about matter here, it almost seems pantheistic in the idea that God is in the universe, it is in matter.
I would say that I'm a panentheist.
So,
So
I did. So no, that clears it up. So I did misrepresent you in my opening statement because I had a dualism of here. That there was a creator and a creation, and so that God stands above the world, and he has to because he creates it ex nihilo. So this is a different model of God, and I probably should have done a better job.
Oh no, it's absolutely fine. Like I would go so far as to argue that I think that both Hegel and Aquinas are both panentheists as well. But that's like an interpretation of like Hegel and Aquinas,
so
right?
because I say the way I read a lot of Hegel is that you see Aristotle, you see Aquinas, and then you kind of see Spinoza take it to another level, and then Hegel kind of takes Spinoza and goes another step further.
That's the thing. He's from the absolute substance to the absolute. But I mean, that's the difference between, I think, our positions right now. Like, I think that fundamentally, like, your position, like,
are a lot closer than what this debate would make it sound like.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, so if you're like, do you reject the Spinozian position of an absolute substance for the Hegelian position of an absolute mind? I mean, that's the difference, really, like between our positions. I would say that I would affirm that there is an absolute mind, which is the absolute knowing, which is why at the end of existence is perfect self-actualization of a mind, and a divine mind. Where if you're from the more Spinozian position, you just say, well, it's an absolute substance, but it doesn't have to be aware of itself.
Yeah. Spinoza's view creates all sorts of problems for like providence. So the idea that God performs miracles, well, that's going to be problematic because the natural laws just are the divine will.
Well, I don't think there's a problem. I think that I think a lot of the time, this approach clears up a lot of the Humean mistakes that we see around miracles, right? Like where miracles are interpreted as a supernatural as opposed to natural, where the Aristotelian teleological approach would say, well, if nature is the substantial will of God, is essentially the end of like God willing himself, ad infinitum or completely, then like eternally, then what really we're saying is that a miracle is only essentially not as natural as the laws of nature, right? In the same respect, it's just God changing what is a chain from which he's essentially already established, which is absolutely fine because the end goal was always God's will. So if we agree that God was to essentially if the end is always God, which is what Aquinas is, right? The end of nature is God. The end of all things is God. And I think that clears things up. But I think that it's whether you take that view. We should probably I know we're very deep in the metaphysics, in the metaphysical rabbit hole, right? And I know we should probably move on to what you called the problems of well, I mean, I know we need to talk about mind, right? Like, and what you mean by mind, because obviously, right now it sounds like I'm an absolute lunatic.
Let me see if I can try to
conscious,
put a point on it so that for the audience, we can kind of wrap this part of it up and see if I for my birthday recently, I got from my mom the book by Alyssa Ney, and it's called The World in the Wave Function. And I've just absolutely been poring over it for the past couple of weeks. I love it. And so the idea that she gives in this book is that the most fundamental thing that exists in the universe is a universal wave function of quantum mechanics. And so that all other phenomena emerge from this universal wave function. And that's what I'm saying is being itself, really. Like that description of the universal wave function of quantum mechanics would be the would be being itself. And so we would be able to say about this that it's necessary, timeless, purely actual, spaceless, and sui generis. And so I think these were kind of all the properties that you ascribe to God on your panentheist model. And so I want to say that, like, we stop there. Like, we don't add this additional property of being personal, like of having a mind, beliefs, and desires, and intentions, acts for reasons, and has cognition. On your panentheist model, agreeing that God is necessary, timeless, purely actual, spaceless, and sui generis, in what does add, if we say, okay, this is God, what does calling it God get us as far as natural theology is concerned? And I think that probably will draw it together where our differences are.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've heard. So I'm actually having a conversation with what's he called soon as well. Actually, on I imagine it'll dip into this. What's he called? Bernardo Castro, because I mean he's big into this, right? Yeah, he's big into this. And I think that the difference is that, like, so for example, Castro, I think, is very partial to your view in this respect. And when we talk about the collapse of these wave functions, he doesn't actually say, he's unwilling to say that the collapse into the sort of macroscopic reality that or not even macroscopic, like that's probably the wrong term, the sort of what we would perceive as sort of concrete real reality in terms of like the existence of atoms and so on like that. He takes that, from what I've understood, is almost illusory. And what exists is actually just this quantum field, right? And that the collapse that we perceive that sort of generates this existence is essentially it hasn't got any truth or reality in itself, right? Where the view that I'm offering is essentially an explanation of not only why that would collapse, why that necessarily must collapse, but an explanation of how it could be understood to exist in the first place. Because the point that I've been trying to sort of drive home is that if we say that, reality is constitutive of ideas, and we say that these ideas are real essences, and that, there is a real qualitative distinction, like there are real facts and distinctions in reality, that those facts and distinctions in reality are purely formal at their foundation, right? There is no matter in this, but they are like essentially a rational coherence, self-coherence. That rational self-coherence, when we're talking about this thing, is a contingent being. When we talk about this relationship that the wave function has to reality in its relation to its expression through, what Kant would call categories of the understanding, what Hegel calls like the sort of categories that exist in reality. The difference is that these categories are given a real substantial existence in a mind. That's the separation between like Spinoza and Hegel, right? Where there isn't these real substantial differences. You could have this wave function. It's all like everything that it collapses into is an illusion, but it doesn't explain why it's collapsing. It doesn't explain like why we even believe it exists in terms of having a specific relation to itself, because all it would be is an existence, and you'd end up with a kind of Kantian noumena. And Hegel's just going to say, well, that's just an immediacy of being. And the immediacy of being is essentially the only way that we can actually even say it exists in the first place is to give it, is to essentially negate it. So I have to say, like, no, it doesn't exist. At least it doesn't exist as a one, it exists as a many. And we start positing individual members, and the collective of those individual members in its unity now formulates the foundation of that being. So the difference is essentially that God, in this perspective, is a being which unites every single specific instance or specific particular which this universal is collapsed into in relation to the universal, which would be what Kant describes as singularity and what Hegel calls individuality. So like when we're talking about the individuality of God, or even like of minds, when we talk about a mind and we talk about, it's just the unity of our perception, right? Like it's the unity of specific ideas in relation to a perceived horizon from which a specific agent is engaging with, right? So what we'll have is specific ideas, which are essentially formal entities related to one another. How they're related to each other is essentially the unity of the individual. That's what Hegel's saying. And so if we say that reality itself is intimately related to in this way, and it's formally an idea, that it's essentially this. It's not a merely a posteriori sort of accident or whatever, but it actually exists in such a way that it has a foundational principle, and this foundational principle unites it. Then what we have is a being which is aware of the principality that unites it. It's aware of its own existence, or that it is a being that is conceiving of its own existence. They have the thing thinking of itself, and he's essentially defending the cogito there in many ways, and even the Aristotelian prime mover. I think the difference is it offers a teleological account for why the events in the causal chain is essentially moving towards an end. I remember talking to Emerson Green about this, and even just in relation to things like mechanical principles, things like evolution, it offers the benefit of saying, like, actually, the reason that these and this is Hegel again, I'm like, there is identities are attempting to gain stability. And once you posit that actually an identity is trying to gain stability, that's because the overall goal is a stable identity. And that is essentially what it's aiming towards. And that's a teleological approach. You can't have a teleological approach without positing essentially this unified existence where it is essentially aware of itself.
So that's the claim that I find interesting, this unity that has to be aware of itself. So like when you say, like, how are you cashing out has to be aware of itself? So
I would say the unity is the awareness of itself, if that makes
the
it
unity
clear.
is the unity is the awareness of itself.
I'm stealing it straight from Kant. You know, it's like
I've struggled with this myself. Like this is more like I've read this in both Kant and some secondary literature for Hegel, because this is the move that I don't quite see, because to me it seems like this move to this unity can be achieved with something like an abstract object. Like it's when we start attributing to it something like awareness, like this unity itself has an awareness, or that the unity is the awareness. This is just where this is the part where I go, I don't know how we get. I don't know how that moved.
Well, I think that's probably because Kant is really, from his perspective, he's saying that this uniting force is the subject, right? And the subject's categorical.
Yeah, our mind, when we come to the object, our minds are the unifying process of it, right?
Mm-hmm. And before that, there is actually there's no essence there, right? For Kant. Now, for Hegel, it's kind of complicated. There is an essence there.
More dynamic.
Yeah, it's more dynamic. Yeah, it's there is an essence there, but in attempting to, like, in this process of trying to establish a stable identity, it necessarily, and you can even see there's two ways that you can kind of look at the necessity of this. It necessarily relates to producing a mind. Like, minds have developed for a reason. Hegel's saying that they are developing for a specific reason, and that they are going to develop and would have always developed for a specific reason, because the relationship that a mind has to nature is this, essentially, that nature is positing essentially you have an identity which is trying to stabilize itself. That identity that relates to essentially where he sees this as a basic formal physical mechanistic process. Then that turns into a chemical process which establishes an internal identity versus an external identity, and you have like particle physics and like chemistry. Then you have the development of biology, and biology coming from this, in the sense that there is this constant development towards attempting to gain a stable identity. You have this process in which it is self-replicating and self-sustaining in order to try and create a more and more complex and stable identity, or the increasing complexity in relation to the stable identity. And as it moves onwards, you end up with the attempt to fulfill that goal with the product or with the with what it was like. So you go from the nutritive, as Aristotle would call it, because Hegel loves the Aristotelian soul, which is essentially just the self-sustaining processes of a natural being, to the animal soul, and that's the animated, self-directed attempts to sustain the identity. So you have at that point the birth of the subject, which is essentially that the goal itself is birthing a process which would maximize the likelihood that it will self-sustain. So it's like if the goal is a self-sustaining unity, it will create a subject in order to self-sustain to a greater and greater degree, and that this process will create a complexity. And this is why it's very, very much connected to like evolution. It will create a process which gets ever increases in complexity ad infinitum, in order to postulate a more and more a being which can sustain itself more and more. In that process, it becomes rational, because nature is unable to facilitate for Hegel an implicit essence, unity between its being and its essence. It realizes that it can't facilitate itself in relation to itself. And then you have like the unity of species, where it's like, okay, now you can recognize other members of your species. You can gain points of communication which aid you in facilitating those natural drives, which allow you to sustain yourself, and also posit alternative ends which unite that dialectical viewpoint, right? Whereas this one being and its negation, which is the other. And the point that Hegel's saying is that the unity of all of these beings, like if we say, I mean, like from the Christian standpoint, the unity of all of these beings is essentially absolute love. If we see that these beings can be absolutely united, which Hegel's saying they must be, and they're moving towards a process politically towards being absolutely united, they're moving towards the kingdom of heaven. I think he wrote that I don't know if it was Feuerbach, he wrote that, let the kingdom of heaven come. And we are moving politically towards this process of an ever-increasing complexity. Then what we have is essentially a natural process which is directed towards the production of a being which can establish for itself its essence to itself. And that's because it is the same process that we see in its sort of initial standpoint. And the reason that you can't have that in an abstract object is, one, you'd say, well, you couldn't have it, otherwise it wouldn't. If it would have worked in a purely abstract way, it would have, but it didn't. So, like, one thing you just referenced is that it clearly is moving towards the production of consciousness. And then the next is to say that the rational mind, because of its essentially adds the capacity of self-reflection, is able to posit at a much greater and faster rate, which shows a developing complexity. The more you ramp that up, the more you gain this unity of absolute spirit, right? Which is why absolute spirit, and remember, it's retrocausative. So the whole point is that this has happened prior to the causal structure beginning, because that like
it's like the unfolding of a flower.
Yeah.
You have bud, and then through time, the flower unfolds to reveal the many layers.
Exactly.
Just want to jump in real quick there, fellas. I'm going to give you another about 5 minutes of this open discussion, and then we're going to jump into the super chats. So I just want to let everybody know we still have lots of space and time for more super chats. So if you have a question for our debaters, get those in. Go ahead, fellas, carry on.
Yeah, but the question is, do we have infinite space and time, right? You know, so that was like a stupid Kantian joke. Okay, like the point is essentially like even the unity of like a tree, right? Like the progenesis of a species can only be understood if we unite an identity which essentially posits the end as explaining the efficient cause. So the final cause explains the efficient cause, right? So you have this, so when it's retrocausative, and when we talk about something like a wave collapse of a quantum field, we already have to posit that it not only it must collapse, that when it collapses in a certain way, that the reason it was collapsing is essentially to achieve a certain end. And that end is essentially this movement towards this sort of this overall completeness, that it establishes that existence establishes its essence, because existence and essence are one and the same, right? Like it's kind of like saying you could have an identity of something, but you wouldn't be able to say what it is, or or that, that it wouldn't necessarily be itself. It doesn't exist. It doesn't make sense to say that it's something that's not itself, right?
Gotcha. So with our last few minutes here, how would you want to just wrap up in the sense of, I can kind of go through what I mean by, the one. Like, I know I've kind of I put that concept on the table and didn't really unpack it, because it sounds, a lot of what you've said here, I think can be done on a theoretical, metaphysical, speculative level by an abstract object. So let me say something briefly about this, because I'm kind of harking back to Plato and Parmenides here. And so on my view, the one, this is a logical entity. It's a Platonic object, a universal abstract object, whatever term you want to use. It's important to realize that this is not a person. It's not a deity of any kind. But it is what Eric Steinhardt called self-maximizing self-congruency. So congruency is what I take to be the sort of unity that you're describing, this purely positive logical value that includes things like consistency, harmony, complexity, order, like you were talking about with the teleological argument, beauty. Yep. These are all ways of expressing this self-maximizing self-congruency that we find throughout the world. And so I take this to be a very Hegelian idea as well. And so on this model, the purpose of the universe is to contribute as much as possible to cosmic computation. So realizing things, making the possibilities of the universal wave function of quantum mechanics actual. And actual universes in universal wave function exist for the sake of the computation. They exist in order to give concrete existence to certain optimal sequences of computable objects. So the whole point of my methodological naturalist argument is to say that whatever explanatory role, when we look to the historical and natural sciences, and even when we look into metaphysics, any role that we once attributed to this God, that would be a person that would act for reasons, have beliefs, desires, intentions, answer prayers, yada, yada, yada. Any role that we assigned to this being could be equally or better done by the role of an abstract object. Now, I know a lot of, especially atheists in my camp, are kind of bristle the idea of, Platonic objects or the existence of universals. But that's the nature of metaphysics. Metaphysics is, these metaphysical speculations, I agree, can only take us so far. But really, those are the only tools that, the way I see it, that you and I could possibly have to try to resolve our disagreements. You mentioned earlier, all the scientific facts, it seems like we agree on them. So it's not like we're going to have some sort of science experiment that is going to settle our disagreement. What we're going to have to do is actually go in and do
metaphysics.
The metaphysical
God
reasoning.
forbid.
Yeah, you're going to have to read Hegel. You're going to have to read Kant. You're going to have to read Plato. You're going to have to, it's hard stuff, and it's important.
Is that a good enough spot to stop their perspective, or do you have a couple more words you want to share quick?
I don't want to do Ben a disservice and try to say why I don't agree with the idea that it could be an abstract object and not fulfill it, because I think I've already outlined in some respects what I take to be the case. But I just want to say that I don't think that an abstract object could do it. So that would be, I think, a port of call if we were to ever have another conversation as to why an abstract object couldn't fulfill this. And I think it does boil down to that separation between Spinoza and Hegel. Spinoza's is an abstract object, Hegel's is a subject. So we'll have to move between that abstract object to subjectivity. And maybe we'll or what he calls the absolute.
When we have that next conversation, though, I'll be sure to make sure I have your model of God right beforehand.
Oh no, it's no problem. It's no problem, man. Like I'll make sure that I actually have the time to structure a solid opening. So, but it's been really fun. I've enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, our chat is enjoying it a fair amount as well. It's very electric in there. Shout out to Eddie E. I was having a little fun with him. Before we get into the super chats, in case I didn't mention it yet, maybe it hasn't been said. I need to make absolutely sure it's said. If you're in Austin, Texas, Modern Day Debate is coming live to a stage near you. You can grab tickets right now in the description. And if you want, you can go right into that Indigo campaign as well and show your support to James financially. I promise you, if you buy a ticket for DebateCon 4, James will set your chair up personally. I mean, he's going to set all the chairs up anyways. But yeah, he'll be there and he's happy to do it. All right. Also, Modern Day Debate is growing fast. So get your subscriptions. Hit that subscription button, and on your way over, hit that like button as well. I have some super chats we're going to read right now. If you guys have any other super chats you want to provide for our debaters, feel free to add them to the chat. All right. So for $5, Contrarian 420, do both panelists accept that all concepts, whether materialistic or spiritual, are inherently limited, that the description is not the described?
So I certainly would want to warn against confusing the map for the territory, because that's obviously a mistake. I don't know exactly what the questioner means by saying our concepts are limited. So, I mean, obviously our concepts are limited insofar as they're distinct from one another. You know, the way we demarcate concepts from one another, those are obvious limitations. But I think they probably have something stronger in mind that I would probably want to push back on, because again, one of the Hegelian themes that I've been most sympathetic to in my readings of Hegel is the idea that knowledge of the world as it is in itself is always mediated by concepts. So like there's no way to like get over and above our concepts. I mentioned it earlier about Wilford Sellers. He calls this the myth of the given, this idea of this neutral space where we can just start with everything given and then build our concepts. No, I think it's concepts all the way down.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said that better. It's concepts all the way down. Like, it's the best way to. It's all the way back up as well. You know, like depending on which way you want.
Yeah, whatever direction we go,
whatever direction you go, and like it is. But I think again, like as you sort of say with that, is you get this point of going like, what the one I say is like, you know, when you say like there's the map and then there's the territory, like I think the important thing to recognize is that there's the map and the territory are like, the territory itself is a kind of mental map that was sort of created in it's a mediated construct, and the difference is whether you want to say that there is a real material reality and whether there is, or it bottoms out in essence. If it bottoms out in essentially in essence, I think then you're going to end up having to say that there is essentially a point in which there is a unity of existence with essence, and I think that that's what I think he's pushing back on. If there isn't a unity of existence and essence, to the point in which there is like an actual truth, then I mean, I think everything is a fiction at that point. You know, it's like, what are we doing? You know, like you know, we're talking. I think that I think it's a very naive
theory for every domain of the world.
Yeah.
Just like, can you imagine a more implausible view?
Oh no, it would be awful. It would be awful. It would be terrible. But yeah, I mean, like, I'm with you. I think that it doesn't make sense, the idea of an absolutely unmediated reality. I find that so impossible. I think but I mean, this is the product of empiricism. I think that that's what we're seeing, materialistic empiricism.
All right. Thank you very much. Our next super chat is from Experiments in Prebiotic Chemistry for $5. The only thing that matters in these debates is whether mind-body dualism is true, because that is the basis of most religions, isn't it? Thanks.
So I think there is something, I don't know if I'd put it quite the way they did. I do think that there's an evidential connection here between substance dualism and what is often contrasted with it, which is just called physicalism. And so if the world were to turn out fundamentally to be a dualistic world, in the sense that there's this sharp distinction between mind and matter, I think that would be evidence for some form of deity, at least, or creator deity, in the sense of there's a mind that is distinct from the natural world, and it created the natural world for a reason. But evidence is a symmetrical relationship, and so I think that insofar as we have evidence for physicalism, to say that, like, no, all the minds that we are aware with are at least dependent on something physical, that's evidence against that model of God. I gave this argument as the argument for physical minds, to say that substance dualism and this radical dualistic natural supernatural concept of God is inconsistent with our what we already know. But it turns out that Lewis's model of God does not have this radical distinction. So at the end of the day, I gave 4 reasons of, against theism, and I think that one with the consistency with background knowledge isn't going to carry much weight here, because I had the wrong model of God as my target.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that, like, I would be saying, like, all religion is dualistic because I'm a monist, right? So, like, and I even think that Thomas Aquinas is a monist. I'd say that the Catholic position is one of monism, which is why God is the end of all things. Not all Catholics, obviously, it's a very diverse tradition, but I think that the
Protestants are
Thomistic.
raging so hard right now.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Like, honestly, the Christian infighting is the best kind of infighting. It's so unbelievably unsympathetic for whatever reason. Like, but the thing is, like, you'd be surprised at how passionate, like, even Orthodox and Catholics can argue over the.
Both
I mean,
of
they're
our
wrong. I mean,
camps,
they're
both of
absolutely
our
wrong.
camps will eat their own. I've seen it happen. It's
Oh,
wild.
exactly. It's. I mean, the thing is, I'm saying this. I'll be like, no, the Orthodox are wrong. The Protestants are wrong. So I'm just as bad in some respects. But yeah, like, but I was just gonna say, like, there are monistic accounts, and I mean, you've got loads of religions that are monistic. I mean, there's monistic interpretations of Hinduism, there's monistic interpretations of Buddhism, there's monistic interpretations of Catholicism, like I'm presenting
There's
now.
monistic interpretations of Taoism.
There's more to
like literally the tradition that's like dual everything.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's so, like, maybe it's just a little bit more mediated. Don't worry, it's not all mind-body dualism.
All right, thank you very much. Brett Bernhoft, $2, asks, what does the Bible say about homosexuality?
I mean, it depends on your interpretation, right? Like, I as a Catholic, I'm happy to say that the interpretation of the Bible is in relation to the living tradition, which is constantly being understood. So I don't think we understand the Bible in its entirety. I don't think we understand the concepts, and how to even read them. And I'm a big fan of hermeneutics in this. So I think that the problem is that a lot of people want to read scripture and they want to look towards it and take a literal interpretation and say it says, well, the gays are bad and we should hate the gays, and all that, without actually analyzing the underlying expressions of these things. It's kind of like, the way I would approach it is kind of like a psychoanalyst approaching the contents of a dream narrative, in the same way as you would analyze the contents of a spiritual narrative in terms of revelation. Like, why is this being said? Not what is the contents of just what you're saying, and it's sort of dumb understanding, like, sort of dumb basic reading that an evangelical will sort of spout out. But why is this written this way? What kind of revelation are we supposed to be getting from this? And what does this indicate to us? And I think when you look into hermeneutics, you realize that without considering the things like intentionality of the author, without considering what unifies the piece in relation to things like love, and ultimately this relationship between the individual passage and the unity of the overall conceptual end, the Bible becomes incoherent anyway. So does pretty much everything. I mean, that's philosophical hermeneutics. Arguably, so does all of reality. So I don't think that we should be reading the Bible to hate the gay people and do all the nasty things, because I think that actually goes against many of the underlying fundamental principles of Christianity.
So, any of those of listeners that might be familiar with my backstory, I grew up in a fundamentalist Quaker tradition in the American South, and I have a gay younger brother. And so you can imagine that didn't go over quite well by many members of my family. And so this is one of those topics where I have a horse in the race. And I remember when I was once a theist myself, and it was in struggling with certain questions like this one in particular that eroded my faith over time. And in my experience, the two things that really stuck out in my mind is the first, the Old Testament is the only place where you actually find statements about homosexuality. It's actually not very much mentioned in the New Testament. It is not mentioned at all by the person of Jesus. And so you have to have a pretty tenuous reading of certain scriptures in order to draw the conclusion that you want. In the analogous way is you can try to read the Bible to be the idea that the sun orbits the earth. But again, I think if you, like Lewis said, I would echo much of what he said. Like if you really go into the hermeneutics of it and you really like, what is the intent of this passage? You know, is a lot of this is literature, and it's like the writers had an intent and a purpose, and that just wasn't the intent and purpose for it. But the second point that I think is what does it matter? Even if, you know, it said clearly in the Bible, homosexuality is wrong. The question is, why is homosexuality wrong? We would still be no clearer into understanding the normative reason why it was wrong. And so this is where this will shade inevitably into critiques of divine command ethics, because where you say, like, just because God commanded it doesn't make it right or good. This is, you know, Euthyphro's dilemma. A lot of ink has already been spilled a lot on this. I've talked about this issue elsewhere in other places for Real Atheology. So again, I have a horse in the race. So I'm certainly biased in this area.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Our next super chat comes from Julio for $5. In a previous debate, Lewis said that materialism has been ripped apart and absolutely destroyed. Ben, what do you make of it?
So I would wonder what the definition of materialism was being used, because I certainly do agree with Lewis that there are certain naive forms of materialism. No one today really thinks that it's just atoms in a void. That's a pretty naive conception of materialism. I find the terms materialism, physicalism, and naturalism to be quite slippery and often used interchangeably and conflated, which is why I tried to give a very precise definition, as precise as can be done for our purposes of naturalism. And so my naturalism is very close to Quine. So Quine famously was a naturalist, but he was also a Platonist. So him and Hilary Putnam developed what was called the indispensability argument, which was basically saying, you know, mathematics is indispensable to science, and mathematics requires us to postulate mathematical objects. And so he was a Platonist. And he thought that our best way of understanding what the world was like is through our explanatory reasoning and our experiences of the world. And so I've tried to keep the spirit of Quine in the presentation that I gave in my opening, of laying out what I think is a plausible form of metaphysical naturalism. But now, again, these are really big questions. This is really deep metaphysics. I don't at all pretend to think that I've had the last word on this. This is just, when I approach these big questions, this is where my thinking at is these days.
What do you mean you haven't finished metaphysics? You haven't
Yeah, I know.
finished philosophy.
German idealism is still incomplete.
No, no. Oh yeah, but no, I think that's, look, I mean, to be fair, like when I criticize physicalism, I take it to be that the natural world can be boiled, well, that the reality can be boiled down to essentially fundamental quantitative principle, like quantitative relations, like charge, position, spin, fundamentally, and that's all. Very much in the sort of light of Bernardo Kastrup in that, where he does the same. And I think my response is to a position like yours would be like, well, at what point isn't it physicalism anymore? At what point is it something else? And are we just adding in a sort of conceptual relation? And that's fine, right? Like, that's not to say that you'd be wrong. It's just to say, like, for the point of what we call it, it seems that when you're not talking about, you even said yourself, you don't believe in an unmediated reality, right? Like, to say that you don't believe in an unmediated reality is to say that, like, reality is in some way, like, where I would call it mind dependent, where you might say that it is, like, dependent upon the existence of abstract objects, which may or may not be immaterial, like, depending on how we define them. So to say that, like, that's physicalist, I think would be like, I would say that's something like a neutral monism, right? Like, it like that, I would normally define something like that as like a neutral monism. But I mean, it doesn't matter really what you call it necessarily to the truth of the position anyway. It's just a point of going, all right, is this position correct, right? Like, that's the big overall goal. But my point really is to say that, like, that kind of naive materialism that you referenced earlier, right? The sort of
Atoms in a void.
atoms in a void, or even abstract physical principle, in the sense of it just boiling down to, like, charge, spin, position.
Scientism. I think we would
Yeah,
both
scientism.
very
Yeah,
critical of a scientistic approach to
yeah,
knowledge.
exactly. And at that point, that's the point in which I think it's been ripped apart by now. I think it's been murdered.
I would agree with that. I think that
Yeah.
it really, I think it was Alex Rosenberg came out with a book, and he kind of tried to re-embrace the label of scientism. I was like, dude, stop. Don't, just stop.
Please. Well, I mean, you like Sellers as well. I mean, you like if you like Sellers, like the two, what is it, the sort of his argument, his two-pronged argument against empiricism is pretty wild. And he has like a big argument against this idea of an unmediated reality, where it's just like absolutely, and then Brandon loves that,
both have interesting arguments along those lines.
Yeah. Sorry. So I'm glad we agree.
All right. Next super chat from Brett Bernhoff again. A question for Ben. What should atheists do about white American Christian nationalism?
Oh man. I wish I had a good answer. So this is a question that I've thought a lot about, certainly in the political realm. It's a very real problem, especially here in America. Unfortunately, about all I'm good for is pointing at the problem. I don't really have solutions.
Can I just say, I think if anything, I know Inspiring Philosophy hates that nationalistic approach. I don't think it has to be racial. I think it's only racial because I think it ties in a lot with racists. But I think it's because it lends itself to fascists just trying
There's
to
a selection effect going on there.
Yeah, it's but I think, like, reality is that if you're a good Christian, like, and you understand Christianity and you have a critical philosophical approach, that I think someone like Hegel would say that the only way you could be truly religious is if you had that kind of philosophical approach. You'd see that as an obscene political stance for a Christian to hold. Like, it's awful. So hopefully go watch Inspiring Philosophy on it. That's he hates it. He hates it.
I have, I guess, radical political views in the sense that I think that voting should be mandatory. I think that it's like, now that doesn't mean like someone should come lock you up if you don't vote. Like you should have to pay a fine if you don't vote. Like I think like if you're going to participate in society, you should be part of the political system. And I think if everyone were required to vote, I think a lot of that nationalist voice would just be drowned out, because I think at the end of the day, and I don't have numbers to back this up, but I suspect the very vast majority of people don't hold those beliefs. And the reason why they're so predominant is because not a lot of the people who don't hold the people who hold those beliefs show up to vote for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's almost as though I'm motivated. I think that like as you said, I don't think it's that obscene to talk about political incentivization. I know Aristotle's a big fan of it, but he thinks of it like, you find the rich, you give to the poor, right? Like, so the poor, like, who don't turn up to vote, and it's largely the poor that don't vote, you give them an incentive to vote. You say, like, if you turn up to vote, you'll gain a tax break. Or if you turn up to vote, you get something positive, and that way you don't have to coerce them as much. And as well, a lot of them don't have anything to lose by not turning up. So, like, you end up threatening them with things like prison time is going to cost the state. So it's I think that, and then as well, like, I mean, like, we could probably have a full conversation about like political, like, constitution, but I think it's incredibly difficult to even get people to vote in their own interests and understand what their interests are. Like, a bunch of uneducated people turning up to vote in relation to causes that don't understand is also a big problem, right? Like, you end up with populism, right? And so yeah, I mean, we've got to do something. I just, but I mean, I'm starting to just turn the news off. I can't look at it. I think I've come to the conclusion that, like, maybe Nietzsche was right. Maybe, like, the life of a philosopher is to just go and live in the woods or something. Like, it's these people, man. Like, what can you do? Like,
Some questions are just beyond me, and I feel like some of those political questions are just. I get that there's a problem there, and I get that something has to be done. But a lot of people seem really confident in their solutions, and I have no idea how they're so
That's the
confident.
problem. That's the problem. Everyone thinks they've got the answer. They don't. They don't have the answer. Stop it. Yeah.
All right. Well, I have an opinion to share, and it's my opinion. Everyone should really quickly run over and just hit that like button for me, okay? Before we finish here for the day, I'd like to see
Opinion, that's a
triple digit
command.
likes. Yeah, man. That's just you got to do. Perspective. Did you hit like yet? Is it you holding it back? Well, yep. He just look. I just saw him go. So Perspective's going to go hit that like button. I already know Ben hit
in
it.
the reflection of his eyes.
If nothing else, Siggy Sigwald, a huge channel supporter. He's here all the time, very active. Just gifted another 50 memberships to everyone watching right now. So if you can't hit like for me or our debaters, hit like for him, so that I get the advantages of those likes for his contribution. But he also contributes a question. So from Siggy Sigwald, our last super chat for the day. I've never been a theist, so I found the idea just ridiculous. For perspective philosophy, how do you cope with the fact that at its core, a belief in God is just an irrational belief, since the argument for a God that could be considered seriously and nowhere near a specific God?
I mean, I completely disagree in the sense that I think that it's absolutely. I mean, the way I argue for God is the exact opposite, right? Like, I don't believe that you can.
Questions are loaded.
Yeah, I don't believe you can have a truly.
By the way, Siggy just did another 20 memberships.
He's just
fantastic.
buying his way to the truth. He's truly political, right? Okay, no, but
anyways.
the thing is that, like, I actually think that you can gain, like, to specific divine attributes, not like some sort of deism. I think that Aquinas does a really good job of outlining from divine simplicity you would gain these attributes. Leibniz argues essentially why you would get to divine simplicity. So does Aquinas, so does Hegel. Hegel argues that there's specific logical relations within God which express the Trinity, and why it necessarily must be structured like this. If you go and check out his arguments in relation to in the science of logic, in relation to universals, particulars, and individuals in relation to the different forms of syllogisms and how it turns into the absolute syllogism. You'll see his defense of the Christian Trinity as the best expression of God. Why it's personhood in the same book. There's loads of arguments for the specific attributes of God and also for God in more abstract ways. I think that the reason that a lot of people typically look towards theists as not being willing to defend specific conceptions of God is because they aren't engaged in philosophy. They're engaged in the theater of debate, specifically online. And it's one thing to run the Calum cosmological argument as someone who's not familiar with philosophy, but there's another thing to be willing to defend the Christian Trinity. That's a much more difficult position to hold. But you can see debates. There was a great debate between Joshua, I can't remember his name. It's like Joshua Sidaway
Sijuani.
Jawani. Right, thank you.
Sijuani.
With a Neoplatonist Muslim. It was like, so it's a Catholic versus a Muslim on the specific attributes of God from basically a Christian Aristotelian perception of God in relation to the Trinity versus essentially a Neoplatonic conception of God, both arguing for concrete relations inside of a concept of divinity. So Christians, even online, are willing to do this. You've just got to find the ones that are willing to do this. You've got to look for the arguments yourself, and maybe stop being so lazy. I don't know.
Well, you're not off the hook yet, Perspective, because while you spoke, Siggy threw another $5 super chat.
I wanted to.
You want to add?
Yeah. Well,
right.
So because I agree with a lot of what Lewis said there. In the sense of, I'm trying to think of who. One of my favorite philosophers of mine right now is Keith Frankish, and I want to say he tweeted it out or something. I can't remember, but it went along the lines of, in philosophy, if you think the answer is obvious, then you haven't understood the question. And and I think that's exactly right. And so, like, if you think any of the questions, perennial questions of philosophy have easy answers or are obvious, I would suggest to put the brakes on and look a little bit more into it, because I think that religious belief can't be reduced to a psychological phenomena of coping with death or something. Like if you look at like the psychological literature for why people are religious, like you just won't find these views in that literature, because I don't think it's a plausible explanation. I think religion serves certain functions. Sometimes it can serve explanatory functions. It tries to make the world more intelligible. Other times it's an expression of a form of life. And so it's just, long story short, it's complicated.
Yeah. I couldn't have said it better myself. I think that's absolutely right, man. Sorry. So what's the next one? Go on.
Siggy Sidwald decided it was worth $5 to claim that not even the Kalam, the closest to an argument for God, gives you a specific God.
Well, yeah, but like an ontological argument does.
I mean, like the point is that it's usually like a series of arguments anyway. So so I know Edward Fazer gives arguments, because I just got sent them before this, where it's like, he's like, read this, go in with this, like, you don't want to be friends. It's the Aquinian position where it's the 5 ways. But like, if you read something, if you pick up something like Summa Theologica, right, and you read proof for the existence of God, and then you go down and you go to the, is God all good? Is God omnipotent? Like, is he all powerful? Is he all knowing? Is he, all present? He gives specific arguments for each one of those divine attributes. If you, as I say, you go into Hegel and they give specific arguments for divine attributes. There are arguments for them, and he might even be just one argument. You might say, like, I often interrelate arguments. There's one argument for one thing, and then from that I can then build it into something more substantial, right? So yeah, like, I do think that Christian debaters online, there's a lot of ones that I'm like, oh God, I can't believe they're representing Christianity. I imagine Ben probably feels the same with like atheist debaters half the time. Like, Like you see certain debates online and you're like, oh dear Lord, like this guy's arguing, that for the stupidest reading of the Bible and just not even listening and just saying that the earth's 5,000 years old. So like, and I want to cry at points like that. So I can understand, we don't have necessarily the best PR team. We don't, we do have a lot of people who are willing to say a lot of stupid stuff. But just, the stupid people everywhere doesn't make what they're trying to express. It might be beyond them. They mightn't understand it themselves, but don't assume that all of our beliefs are the same as theirs,
You got a couple there last words, Ben, before we sign off?
Yeah, so I would recommend to people to really spend some time in classical thinkers from the Western canon of philosophy. So Spinoza's Ethics, Leibniz Monadology, Descartes' Meditations, Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. These are all great ways of getting a good idea of the history of thought about the question of God's existence and how central it has been in shaping our ways of thinking about not just religion in particular, but just in science, history, and art in general. And to have an open mind, face facts brutally, and at all times try to be charitable with the people you're in discussion with, and to make arguments as best you can to try to see what arguments work, what arguments don't work, and if they don't work, why they don't work. You have everything to gain and nothing to lose from honest inquiry like that.
Well, Siggy comes in under the wire here real quick, and I'm going to allow this last super chat. That the ontological argument requires you have faith to be convinced by it. The kalam goes from something to someone without proper justification.
I mean, look, I'm not here to defend. Like, I think the ontological argument requires essentially I would go so far as to say that the ontological argument requires the existence of a necessary being to be given credence, so that the necessary being is the being thinking of itself, which is why I think it relates to a teleological argument. But I think that the way that it's structured in the sort of Hegelian standpoint is to say that both the cosmological and the teleological and the ontological argument are essentially interconnected in the sense that none of the arguments stand alone, that they are essentially very, very much in the Hegelian sense, performing different rational functions in relation to giving explanatory power in relation to sort of the functions of or sort of logical functions. So, each syllogism has its own purpose in relation to the specific causal account of God, which you're aiming at that point. So whether it's the formal account, which is the ontological argument, whether it's the final account in the teleological argument, or whether it's the efficient account in the cosmological argument, I think that they all have specific logical functions and they're all interrelated. And the point of Hegel and Aristotle is to say that these causes are necessarily codependent anyway. So I don't think any one of those arguments by themselves can stand scrutiny if you don't understand the other arguments and the other aspects of identity that are essentially being argued from the other perspectives. In relation to, people arguing the kalam, it depends on who's arguing it and why and what they're arguing. They might throw some other arguments in there. Depends on who's doing it again. Do you know what I mean? So yeah. But thanks. And again, Ben, I think just to quickly say, like, I think you're absolutely right as well in saying like good honest discussion is like the best way to go. Good honest inquiry, and I think you've exhibited those virtues yourself in this conversation. I think it's been really great.
I think the same of you too. I'm so glad that we were finally able to do this, and I can't wait to do it again.
I think the level of respect during this entire debate was incredibly high. I think even maybe a bar has been raised. So much so that Siggy sends another $2 just to thank you for answering his questions. You're good for perspective. You're good. Awesome. You're good. But he spends more money to show gratitude. So from myself, from Eddie E, Siggy, Perspective Philosophy, Ben Watkins. Thanks everyone for hanging out with us tonight, or this afternoon rather, depending on where you are. And if you're in Austin, Texas, don't forget to check out DebateCon 4. You may have missed the first 3. Don't miss this one. It's going to be amazing, as a certain someone we all love would say. Gentlemen, have a great night, and take it easy. We'll see you all again next time, hopefully.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.